So good evening. Welcome to the inaugural Lester Kissel lecture. My name is Lester Lessig. It's completely true. I didn't make that up. And I'm the director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, and honored this evening to launch the series with absolutely the very best possible inaugural lecturer, Michael Sandel. You can check that on Google. I looked it up, to kick the series off. I'm going to say a few words about Lester Kissel, and then I've invited Eric Bierbaum, the director of the Graduate Fellowship in Ethics, to introduce Professor Sandel. Lester Kissel graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1925 and attended the University of Geneva in Switzerland in 1926 and 1927. He received a JD from this law school in 1931. So he was a lawyer, but not just a lawyer. For many years, Kissel practiced as an attorney in the New York firm of Seward and Kissel. But over his career, Lester Kissel developed a serious interest in Hindu philosophy and made frequent trips to India to study and learn from the Hindu tradition. That experience, tied to his long-standing interest in values in public and professional life, inspired Kissel to initiate a series of letters and then conversations with then-President Derek Bok and later with President Neil Rudenstein. These conversations then led to an enormously generous endowment to the contribution to the center, which now supports this lecture series as well as the Edmund J. Safra undergraduate fellowships in ethics. I'm not sure if the Indian Hindus did as well, but we'll put that aside. The undergraduate fellowships is an innovation that we have launched that I'm especially proud that we've been able to develop. It aims to offer undergraduates a unifying academic experience for undergraduates pursuing research in ethics to discuss their work across departments and engage in an informed analysis of values in their area of inquiry. Undergraduate fellows will participate in a series of workshops designed to develop their competence in modes of critical inquiry, to addressing the important moral issues in public life. To help foster the cross-disciplinary connections, they will attend lectures and other center events and interact with faculty in their field. Tonight, they will ask the first questions of our lecturer. And our bet is that these offerings will bring a fresh perspective to the issues at the core of the center's research and extend that perspective into the undergraduate life at Harvard. I never had the chance to get to know Lester Kissel. He died in 2000 at the age of 97. It is said he long held the conviction that even the youngest scholars can benefit from the center's work. I'm not sure whether that was a polite version of only the youngest scholars can benefit from the center's work, or whether Kissel thought the youngest as well as the oldest can benefit, but I'm extremely excited to see this part of the center grow, grateful to Michael Sandel for helping us to celebrate its launch, and especially grateful to Eric Bierbaum, who has worked tirelessly over the past 3 years to architect this program and to get it to this point where we can launch it tonight. So with thanks to Eric, I want to invite him to the podium to introduce our lecturer, Michael Sandel.
What a pleasure it is to introduce my colleague Michael Sandel, the Ann T. and Robert M. Bass Professor of Government. When Prospect Magazine asked him in the fall what he would do if he ruled the world, if he became a philosopher king, Michael answered, "I would rewrite the economics textbooks. One of his first decrees would be to forbid the use of the word incentivize." Now, Michael isn't allergic to all incentives. As president of his senior high school class in California, a surprisingly long-haired, elbow-patched Sandel, I would put up a photograph if I was feeling more mischievous tonight, offered the then Governor Ronald Reagan an incentive he could not refuse. He personally delivered an invitation to debate and a 6-pound bag of jelly beans to the governor's residence. As an undergraduate at Brandeis University, Michael interned as a political reporter during the summer of 1974, covering the Watergate hearings, where he saw an emerging political market in lockpicks and flashlights. When he got on the ship with his fellow Rhodes Scholars bound to England. Michael expected to study welfare economics at Oxford, only to be distracted by a copy of John Rawls' Theory of Justice. Michael's first book, Liberalism, the Limits of Justice, launched a debate that's still going on between liberals and civic Republicans. His other works, which have been translated into 18 languages, include Democracy's Discontent, Public Philosophy, The Case Against Perfection, and last year, What Money Can't Buy. Michael's objection to conflating market reasoning with ethical reasoning is especially timely, for right now, area hardware stores are being tempted to raise the price of snow shovels. To those students and teachers of economics in the crowd, be afraid, but not too afraid. Michael insists that some of my best friends are imperial economists. But I would be a little worried. For those of us Kantians, we know what it's like to be on the receiving end of his pointed objections and counterexamples. He is a gadfly in the best sense of the word. Over 15,000 Harvard undergraduates have seen Michael demonstrate that philosophy can remain rigorous while being great theater. A student publication lampooned him with the headline, "Harvard professor Michael Sandel was tragically killed today in a freak accident involving a runaway trolley. However, 5 others were saved." If you believe that the would-be creators of The Simpsons were students in his core course, Justice, you might entertain the urban legend that a certain market-minded character in the show, Montgomery Burns, was inspired by Michael's visage. We can say with confidence that Michael has brought political and moral theory to more people than anyone ever. And this spring, he's expanding his audience to the global classroom with Gen Ed 22X. In a preface to one of his books, he writes, "For all we may resist such ultimate questions as the meaning of justice and the nature of good life, what we cannot escape is that we live some answer to these questions. We live some theory all the time." Michael served on the founding committee of the center back when it was the Program in Ethics in the Professions, this 26-year-old university interfaculty, and we now hope inter-student initiative. So it's especially fitting that he is inaugurating this Kissel lecture series tonight. This summer, he drew a crowd of 14,000 as he lectured in an outdoor amphitheater in Seoul, South Korea. Well, today let's make up for our numbers with our warmth in welcoming Professor Sandel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I want to begin by thanking Eric for those warm words of introduction and for his leadership in bringing the Safra Center for Ethics to an undergraduate constituency, and also to Larry, who has really been a terrific leader of this center, bringing it from strength to even greater strength. So it's a special honor to be here on this occasion and to participate in bringing the work of the center and the great work of Larry and Eric to this undergraduate and university community. When I was first exposed to economics as an undergraduate, I was bedazzled by it. I loved its clarity and rigor. I especially loved the idea that big questions of social and political life could be answered without engaging in messy, seemingly subjective debates about values. And so economics beckoned and inspired as a value-neutral science of social choice. I no longer see it that way. In fact, the idea that economics offers a value-neutral science of social choice is widely influential, but deeply flawed, or so it seems to me. And that's what I would like to talk to you about tonight. I think it's flawed for a number of reasons, but I would like to focus on 2 in particular. 2 assumptions that are widely held among economists, but actually rarely explicitly defended by them. 2 assumptions that also seem to me mistaken. The first is the idea that markets are inert. inert in the sense that they do not touch or taint or change the goods they exchange. The second assumption is that market relations save us from squandering the limited supply of altruism, solidarity, and civic virtue. Now, I come to this discussion tonight about the perils of thinking like an economist from a more general concern with a question, what should be the role of money in markets in our society? And that's the question from the recent book that Eric mentioned, What Money Can't Buy. My short answer to that question, what should be the role of money in markets in our society, is less than it is today. The last 3 decades have seen markets and market reasoning extend their reach into spheres of life previously governed by non-market norms. Areas such as family life, personal relations, health, education, procreation, the environment, law and criminal justice, health, military service, citizenship. This seems to me, taken as a whole, a troubling development. And in explaining why it seems to me troubling, I hope to shed some light, or at least to provoke a debate, about the flaw in the economic way of thinking about life. Now, most economists prefer not to deal with moral questions, at least not in their role as economists. They say their job is to explain people's behavior, not judge it. Telling us what norms should govern this or that activity, or how we should value this or that good, is not, they insist, what they do. The price system allocates goods according to people's preferences. It doesn't assess those preferences as worthy or admirable or appropriate to the circumstance. But despite these protestations, economists increasingly find themselves entangled in moral questions. I think this is happening for 2 reasons. One reflects a change in the world. The other, a change in the way economists understand their subject. The change in the world is the one to which I just referred. In recent decades, markets and market thinking have reached into a great many spheres of life. More and more, we are using cash incentives or the price system to allocate goods. And at the same time, economists in recent decades have been recasting their discipline, making it more abstract and more ambitious. In the past, economists dealt with, economic subjects, inflation and unemployment, savings and investment, interest rates, foreign trade, that kind of thing. They explained how countries become wealthy, how the price system aligns supply and demand for pork belly futures and other market goods. Recently, though, many economists have set themselves a more ambitious project. What economics offers, they say, is not merely a set of insights about the production and consumption of material goods, but a science of human behavior. Now, this idea goes back to Gary Becker's powerful formulation in the 1970s of an economic approach to human behavior, but it's now become quite familiar among economists of many, in fact, most all ideological stripes. But it continues to be the claim of most economists that economics as such does not require engaging with moral philosophy. In Freakonomics, the authors of Freakonomics put this standard wisdom this way. They say, economics simply doesn't traffic in morality. Morality, they write, represents the way we would like the world to work, and economics represents how it actually does work. And that's not an idiosyncratic distinction among economists. The idea that economics is a value-free science independent of moral and political philosophy has always been questionable. But the vaunting ambition of economics today makes this claim especially difficult to defend. The more markets extend their reach into social life, the more entangled they become with moral questions. And I would like to try to explain how this tendency has been unfolding and say something about the challenge that it poses to the way economics is conducted. To do that, I would like to step back from the question of economics as a discipline and its ambitions and ask a question from moral philosophy, which is whether there are some things, some goods, some social practices that money should not be able to buy. And if there are, how can we decide, how can we figure out which goods and activities are properly bought and sold and which ones aren't? One way of trying to answer this question is by beginning with a slightly different one. Are there some things that money can't buy? Most people would say yes, there are. Take friendship. Suppose you want more friends than you have. Would you try to buy some? Not likely. Why not? Well, a moment's reflection would lead you to realize that it wouldn't work. A hired friend isn't the same as a real one. You could hire people to do some of the things that friends typically do, picking up your mail when you're out of town, or looking after your children in a pinch, or in the case of a therapist, listening to your woes and offering sympathetic advice. Until recently, you could even bolster your online popularity by hiring some good-looking friends for your Facebook page for 99 cents per friend per month. The Phony Friend website was shut down, it turns out, when it emerged that the photos being used, mostly of models, were unauthorized. Anyhow, although all of these services can be bought, you can't really buy a friend. Somehow, the money that buys the friendship dissolves it or turns it into something else. The same is true of the Nobel Prize. Suppose you desperately want one, but fail to get one in the usual way. It might occur to you to try to buy one, but that too wouldn't work. The Nobel Prize is not the kind of thing that money can buy. And this would be true even if the Nobel Prize Committee auctioned off, say, one Nobel Prize each year. The Bott Award, see, the problem isn't just that they don't sell them, it's that they couldn't. The Bott Award would not be the same as the real thing, and the reason is pretty self-evident. The market exchange would dissolve the good that gives the prize its value. Once word got out that you had bought your prize, the award wouldn't convey or express the honor and recognition that people receive when they get the real thing, or that you aspire to when it occurs to you to buy one. Now, these fairly obvious examples may offer a clue to the more challenging question that concerns us, which is, are there some things that money can buy but shouldn't? Consider a good that can be bought, but whose buying and selling is morally controversial. A kidney, let's say, for transplantation. Some people defend markets in organs for transplantation, others find them morally objectionable. if it's wrong to buy a kidney, the problem is not, as with the Nobel Prize, that the money dissolves the good. The kidney will work, assuming a good match, regardless of the monetary payment. So to decide whether kidneys should or shouldn't be up for sale, we have to engage in a moral inquiry. We have to examine the arguments for and against organ sales and determine which are more persuasive. So it seems at first glance that there's a sharp distinction between two kinds of goods: the things, like friends in the Nobel Prize, that money can't buy, and the things, like kidneys, that money can buy but arguably shouldn't. But I would like to suggest that this distinction is less clear than first appears. If we look more closely, we can glimpse a connection between the obvious cases in which the monetary exchange spoils the good being bought and the controversial cases in which the good survives the selling but is arguably degraded or corrupted or diminished as a result. We can explore this by considering a case intermediate between friendship and kidneys. If you can't buy friendship, what about tokens of friendship or expressions of intimacy and affection? Take a wedding toast. Traditionally, wedding toasts are warm, funny, heartfelt expressions of good wishes delivered by the best man, let's say, at a wedding. But it's not easy to compose an elegant wedding speech. And many people chosen for this job don't feel up to the task. So some have resorted to buying wedding toasts online. Did you know that? One of these websites is called theperfecttoast.com. It's been in business since 1999. You answer a question online with a few facts about how the bride and groom met and how you would describe them and whether you want a funny speech or a sentimental one. And within 3 business days, you receive a professionally written, custom-made toast of 3 to 5 minutes. The price? What do you suppose? $149, payable by credit card. Now, what is the moral status of a bought wedding toast? One way of thinking about this is to imagine that on your wedding day, your closest friend delivered a heartwarming toast, a speech so moving it brought tears to your eyes. You later learn that he or she didn't write it, but bought it online. Would you care? Would the toast mean less than it did at first, before you knew it was bought, written by a paid professional? Most of us would probably say, yes, the meaning changed. The bought wedding toast has less value than an authentic one. In fact, the test of this is whether if you bought a toast and delivered it, you would reveal its provenance to your friend afterwards. In any case, wedding toasts are probably goods that can be bought in a sense, but buying them changes their character and diminishes their value. Or consider honorific goods. Now, the Nobel Prize can't be bought, but what about other forms of honor and recognition? Take honorary degrees. Colleges and universities confer honorary degrees on distinguished scientists, scholars, artists, public officials, but some recipients are philanthropists who have contributed large sums to the institution bestowing the honor. Are such degrees bought, in effect, or are they genuinely honorific? Well, it can be ambiguous. If the college's reasons were baldly stated, the transparency would dissolve the good. Suppose the citation at commencement read, "We confer honorary degrees upon distinguished scientists and artists for their achievements but we give you this one, and thanks for the $10 million you gave us to build a new library. An award like that would scarcely count as an honorary degree. And of course, the citations are never written that way. They speak of public service, philanthropic commitment, dedication to the university's mission, an honorific vocabulary that blurs the distinction between an honorary degree and a bought one. Similar questions can be asked about the buying and selling of admission to elite universities. Universities don't hold auctions for admission, at least not explicitly. But many selective colleges and universities could increase their revenues if they sold seats in the freshman class to the highest bidder. Even if they wanted to maximize revenue, they probably wouldn't auction off all the seats, because doing so would reduce demand, not only by reducing academic quality, but also by undermining the honorific aspect of admission. But one could imagine that some number of the places, that most were allocated by merit, but a few made quietly available for sale, under conditions such as these, universities could sell some places to wealthy donors without undermining the honor that people associate with admission. Some critics of higher education claim that this scenario comes close to describing what actually goes on these days at many colleges and universities. But what's interesting about this case is that admission to a top college or university is a kind of honorific good, at least in part. And unlike the Nobel Prize, it's an honorific good that can, under these special circumstances at least, be bought and sold, provided the buying and selling take place discreetly. Whether colleges and universities should do so is a further question. Now, if you think about that case, you can imagine two objections to auctioning off, say, 10% of the places in the freshman class. One would be an objection about fairness. What about kids whose parents can't afford it? But a different objection, and a further objection, might be about corruption. The corruption objection would be about the integrity of the institution. It would worry that the ideals that define the purpose of a university, the pursuit of truth, the promotion of scholarly and scientific excellence, and so on, are undermined or not properly honored if admission is bought and sold. And so it's worth thinking about cases where money can buy a good, but arguably shouldn't. It's worth thinking about these, it's worth distinguishing these two objections. Two objections to marketizing goods. The fairness objection asks about the inequality that market choices may reflect, whereas the corruption objection asks about the attitudes and norms that market relations may damage or dissolve. Think back to the kidney case. It's true that money can buy a kidney without ruining its value. But should kidneys be bought and sold? Those who say no typically object on one of two grounds. They argue that such markets prey upon the poor, whose choice to sell their kidney might not truly be voluntary. Or they argue that such markets promote a degrading, objectifying view of the human person as a collection of spare parts. This would be the corruption objection. It's worth noticing an important difference between these two arguments for the moral limits of markets. The fairness objection points to the injustice that can arise when people buy and sell things under conditions of inequality or dire economic necessity. But the corruption objection points to the degrading effect of market valuation and exchange on certain goods and practices. According to this second objection, the corruption objection, certain moral and civic goods are diminished or degraded if bought and sold. Each of these objections points to a different moral ideal. The fairness argument draws on the ideal of consent, or more precisely, the ideal of consent carried out under fair background conditions. The corruption argument points to a different set of moral ideals. It appeals not to consent, but to the moral importance of the goods at stake, the goods said to be degraded by market valuation and exchange. So to decide, for example, whether college admission should be bought and sold, we have to think not only about whether this would be unfair to those whose families can't afford it, we also have to debate the moral and civic goods that colleges should pursue. And we have to ask whether selling admission would damage those goods. The fairness and corruption arguments differ in their implications for markets. The fairness argument doesn't object to marketizing goods on the grounds that they are precious or sacred or priceless or properly valued in a certain way. It simply objects to buying and selling goods against a background of inequality severe enough to create unfair bargaining conditions. The corruption argument, by contrast, focuses on the character of the goods themselves and the norms that should govern them. So it can't simply be met by establishing fair bargaining conditions, even in a society without unjust differences of power and wealth. There would, on the corruption argument anyhow, still be things that money shouldn't buy. And this is because markets are not mere mechanisms. They embody certain modes of valuation. And sometimes market values crowd out non-market norms and attitudes worth caring about. Now, this is the idea, the moral objection to marketizing everything, that takes us back to the first, what I suggested was the first flawed assumption in the economic way of looking at life. How exactly does the crowding out of non-market values take place? How is it that market values corrupt or dissolve or displace non-market norms? Standard economic reasoning assumes that commodifying a good, putting it up for sale, doesn't alter its character or change its meaning. On the standard view, market exchanges increase economic efficiency without changing the goods themselves. Market exchanges make both parties better off without making anyone else worse off. But only if you assume that market relations and the attitudes they foster don't diminish the value of the goods themselves. But this is the assumption I want to question. A growing body of research confirms what common sense suggests. Financial incentives and other market mechanisms sometimes backfire by crowding out non-market norms, sometimes offering a payment for a certain behavior actually gets you less of it, not more. There are a number of illustrations of this crowding out tendency. Perhaps the most familiar is one you've probably heard about, the daycare study in Israel where parents were coming late to pick up their children. With the help of some economists, the daycare centers established a fine for late arriving parents. The result? More parents arrived late to pick up their children. Now, why did putting a price on a late arrival increase rather than decrease late arrivals? Well, the most plausible explanation is that before, parents felt guilty when they came late. They were violating a norm. They had a sense of obligation to turn up on time. Now that they can pay a certain amount of money, they consider the fine as a fee for a service, like hiring a babysitter. And so the guilt was dissolved, driven out by a new way, a new attitude toward the practice of turning up late. In Switzerland, some years ago, they were trying to decide where to locate a nuclear waste site. No community wants one in its backyard. Under the law, the place identified, the people living in the community had to agree. They looked at a number of sites, and the one considered to be the safest geologically was a small town in the mountains of Switzerland. But before the final decision, a survey was done of the residents of the town, and they were asked, if Parliament chooses your town, will you vote to approve the nuclear waste site here? Despite the risk, 51% said yes. Then they were asked a second question, a question that sweetened the deal. The question was, now suppose Parliament chooses your town and votes to pay each resident of the town financial compensation every year. Then would you vote to accept the nuclear waste site here? Now how many do you suppose were willing to accept? What do you think? 100, 60. From 51 only to 60? 90? 20? It went down. It dropped in half from 51% to 25% when the money was offered. Now, from the standpoint of standard economic reasoning, this is a paradox. Normally, when you offer to pay people to do something, the willingness to do that thing increases rather than decreases. So what happened? Well, there are at least two possible explanations. One is, when the people were offered the money, they thought, gee, this must be riskier than we thought. They're willing to pay us. That could be the case, but they tested for that hypothesis. And it turns out that the estimate of the risk by the respondents was about the same before and after the monetary offer was made. So something else must have been at work. And they asked people who had changed their minds, why did you change your mind when you were offered money? And many of them said, we didn't want to be bribed. What seems to have happened is that before, 51% were willing to make a sacrifice for the sake of what they took to be the common good. The country needed the energy, the waste had to go somewhere. If their place was found to be the safest place, they were willing to make that sacrifice out of a sense of civic virtue, public responsibility. But then when money entered the picture, what had been a civic question became a financial transaction. And they weren't willing to sell out the safety of themselves and their families for money. That was a different question, or so it seemed to them. So what this story brings out, you might think that just adding a financial incentive reinforces whatever public-spirited sentiment already is there, increasing support for the nuclear waste site. After all, aren't two incentives, one financial, one civic, better than one? But not necessarily. It's a mistake to assume that incentives of this kind are additive. To the contrary. For the good citizens of this Swiss town, the prospect of a private payoff transformed this civic question into a pecuniary one. The intrusion of market norms crowded out their sense of civic duty. The same economists who did the study of the Israeli daycare centers also did a study of charity collections among students on a day each year called Donation Day, where students would go door to door collecting donations for charitable causes. They divided the students into three groups. The first group got a brief speech about the moral importance of the causes they were supporting, and they were sent on their way to raise funds. The second group was given the same speech, but also offered a 1% commission on all the money they raised. The third group, likewise, but a 10% commission. Which of the three groups do you think raised the most money? The first group. The first group. The one that was not paid at all. Now, the it is true that it turned out that the third group, the 10% group, raised more money than the 1% group. So once you introduce the commission, it does matter how high the commission is. But even the 10%, the group on the 10% commission, raised less money than the kids who got nothing, who were doing it for the love of it, for the cause. Another example of how a cash incentive undermines other kinds of attitudes and norms and motivations. Now, what can we conclude from this? Well, with regard to the first assumption about markets changing the character of goods or of social practices. What these stories, empirical studies suggest is something of pretty far-reaching significance for the first assumption I identified. If it's the case that introducing the price system or a market mechanism or a cash incentive can drive out certain attitudes and norms, certain ways of valuing goods, then even to predict behavior, never mind to judge it, economists have to concern themselves with those crowding out effects. But more than that, in order to decide whether to seek after the efficiencies of the price system or of the market mechanism, if it's the case that sometimes cash incentives or the price system drives out non-market norms worth caring about, then to decide whether to use them, we have to weigh and consider what will be the moral effects, the effects on attitudes, the effects on norms, and weigh those effects, which involves moral judgment and evaluation, against whatever efficiency gains may or may not result. So even if there are efficiency gains, it's still a further question whether, all things considered, this was a policy worth embracing. I also want to say something about the second assumption, and then see what you make of all of this. Perhaps the best known illustration of markets crowding out non-market norms was a classic study of blood donation by the British sociologist Richard Titmuss. In his 1970 book, The Gift Relationship, Titmuss compared the system of blood collection used in the UK, where all blood for transfusion was given by unpaid voluntary donors, and the system in the US, where some blood was donated and some was bought by commercial blood banks from people, typically the poor, willing to sell their blood to make money. Titmuss presented a wealth of data showing that in economic and practical terms alone, the British system worked better. But Titmuss also leveled an ethical argument against the buying and selling of blood. He argued that commodifying blood, well, he had two objections. One, he worried that it exploited the poor. That's our fairness objection. But he also objected that turning blood into a market commodity erodes people's sense of obligation to donate blood, and that it diminished the spirit of altruism, that it undermined the gift relationship as an active feature of social life. So this is, though he didn't put it in these terms, this is the corruption objection. It's interesting because a market-based system does not prevent anyone from donating blood if he or she wants to. Just because someone is selling blood doesn't mean I can't give it away. But Titmuss's point was that the market values that come to suffuse such a system may exert a corrosive effect on the norm and the value of giving. Titmuss's book generated much debate. Among his critics was Kenneth Arrow, one of the most distinguished American economists of his time. Now, Arrow was no Milton Friedman-like proponent of unfettered markets. His earlier work had analyzed imperfections in the markets for healthcare. But he took strong exception to Titmuss's critique of economics and market thinking. And in doing so, Arrow invoked two key tenets of the market's faith, two assumptions about human nature and moral life that economists often assert but rarely defend. The first is the one that we've already discussed, the idea that commercializing an activity doesn't change it. On this assumption, money never corrupts, and market relations never crowd out non-market norms. If this is true, if this assumption is true, then the case for extending markets into every sphere of life is hard to resist. If a previously untraded good is suddenly made tradable, no harm is done. Those who wish to buy and sell it can do so, increasing their utility, whereas those who regard the good as priceless are free to desist from trafficking in it. So according to this logic, allowing market mechanisms and transactions make some people better off without making anyone else worse off, even if the good being bought and sold is human blood. Arrow put it this way: economists typically take for granted that since the creation of a market increases the individual's area of choice, it therefore leads to higher benefits. So, if to a voluntary blood donor system we add the possibility of selling blood, we've only expanded the individual's range of alternatives. If he derives satisfaction from giving, he can still give, and nothing has been done to impair that right. But this overlooks the possibility that creating a market in blood does change the meaning and value of giving it. For consider, in a world where blood is routinely bought and sold, is donating a pint of blood at your local Red Cross still an act of generosity? Or is it an unfair labor practice that deprives needy persons of gainful employment selling their blood? If you want to contribute to a blood drive, would it be better to donate blood yourself or to donate $50 that can be used to buy an extra pint of blood from a homeless person who needs the money? A would-be altruist could be forgiven for being confused. The second tenet of market faith that figures in Arrow's critique is that ethical behavior is a commodity that needs to be economized. This goes to the second assumption of much economic thought I mentioned at the outset. The idea is this: we shouldn't rely too heavily on altruism and generosity and solidarity and civic virtue, because these moral sentiments are scarce resources that are depleted with use. Markets, which rely on self-interest, spare us from using up the limited supply of virtue. So, for example, if we rely on the generosity of the public for the supply of blood, the idea is there will be less generosity left over for other social and charitable purposes. But if we use the price system for the blood supply, then people's altruistic impulses will be available undiminished when we really need them. That's the idea. Like many economists, Arrow writes, I do not want to rely too heavily on substituting ethics for self-interest. I think it best on the whole, he writes, that the requirement of ethical behavior be confined to those circumstances where the price system breaks down. We do not wish to use up recklessly the scarce resources of altruistic motivation. This is Arrow. Now, it's easy to see how this economistic conception of virtue, if true, provides yet further grounds for extending markets into every sphere of life. If the supply of altruism and generosity and civic virtue is fixed, as if by nature, like the supply of fossil fuels, then we should try to conserve it. The more we use, the less we have. We should preserve a scarce resource. Now, Arrow didn't come up with this idea on his own. The classic statement of it was offered by a British economist, Sir Dennis Robertson, a Cambridge University economist and former student of Keynes. He gave an address, Sir Dennis did, in an address at Columbia in 1954, and the title of his lecture was a question: what does the economist economize? And he wanted to show that despite catering to what he called the aggressive and acquisitive instincts of human beings, economists nonetheless serve a moral mission. And what was that moral mission? If we economists do our business well, Robertson maintained, we can contribute mightily to the economizing of that scarce resource, love, the most precious thing in the world. Now, to those not steeped in economics, this way of thinking about the generous virtues is strange, even far-fetched. It ignores the possibility that our capacity for love and benevolence is not depleted with use, but enlarged with practice. Think of a loving couple. If over a lifetime they asked little of one another, in hopes of hoarding their love, how well would they do? Wouldn't their love deepen rather than diminish the more they called upon it? Would they really be better to treat one another in more calculating fashion, to conserve their love for the times they really needed it? Similar questions can be asked about social solidarity and civic virtue. Should we try to conserve civic virtue by telling citizens to go shopping until their country needs to call upon them to sacrifice for the common good? Or do civic virtue and public spirit atrophy with disuse? The idea that love and generosity are scarce resources that are depleted with use continues to exert a powerful hold on the moral imagination of economists, even if they don't argue for it explicitly. It is not an official textbook principle like the law of supply and demand. No one has proved it empirically. It's more like an adage, a piece of folk wisdom, to which many economists, even rigorous ones, still subscribe. Almost half a century after Robertson's lecture, the economist Larry Summers, then president of Harvard, was invited to offer the morning prayer in Harvard's Memorial Church. He chose as his theme, quote, what economics can contribute to thinking about moral questions. Economics, he stated, is, quote, too rarely appreciated for its moral as well as practical significance. He illustrated his view by challenging students who had advocated a boycott of goods produced by sweatshop labor. We all deplore the conditions in which so many on this planet work and the paltry compensation they receive, he said. And yet there is surely some moral force to the concern that as long as the workers are voluntarily employed, they have chosen to work because they are working to their best alternative. Is narrowing an individual set of choices an act of respect, of charity, even of concern? And then he concluded with a reply to those who criticize markets for relying on selfishness and greed. Quote, we all have only so much altruism in us. Economists like me, Summers said, economists like me think of altruism as a valuable and rare good that needs conserving. Far better to conserve it by designing a system in which people's wants will be satisfied by individuals being selfish and saving that altruism for our families, our friends, and the many social problems that markets cannot solve. So here is Robertson's adage reasserted. Reckless expenditures of altruism in social and economic life not only deplete the supply available for other public purposes, here they even reduce the amount we have left for our family and friends. This economistic view of virtue fuels the faith in markets and propels their reach into places they don't belong. But the metaphor is misleading. Altruism, generosity, solidarity, and civic spirit are not like commodities that are depleted with use. They are more, it seems to me, like muscles that develop and grow stronger with exercise. One of the defects of the market-driven societies in which we live is that they let these virtues languish. To renew our public life, it seems to me we need to exercise these virtues more strenuously. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. All right, questions. Thank you. Questions, and per Eric's instructions and Larry's, we're going to start with undergraduates. Am I right? All right. So, who would like to begin? Yes. Stand up, and do we have microphones? Are we going to bring people microphones over here?
Hi there. I just wanted to ask you to expand a little bit. Certainly, economics is elegant, but it also gives a lot of control. And so, for example, when you talk about the Israeli daycare centers, there's a sense in which, yes, you put a small fee on there, and parents are like, great, I'll just pay $3. But the daycare could also say, you know, it's actually worth our time to stay here. If they'll pay this much money, I'll just make the fee that. And those that will pay it, like, I'll stay for that. You can't control these softer virtues that we lose. I'm just curious to hear the trade-off and some thoughts on that.
Well, it's true that the language of control doesn't seem to fit very well with what you call the softer virtues or the civic virtues or the moral attitudes that may be driven out by market norms. But if human behavior in these social settings is animated partly by money, but also by these attitudes and norms, the sense of feeling guilty arriving late in the daycare center case, then even if we're concerned with prediction and control, we need to take account of these, as you call them, softer virtues, or moral virtues, or civic virtues. Even to predict what will be the effect of instituting this or that cash incentive requires a moral psychology, at least, to try to figure out, will this actually get us more or less of the behavior we want? This is a question that arises, for example, in current efforts to try to improve academic performance, especially in inner city schools, by offering kids cash for good grades, $50 for an A, $35 for a B. They've tried this, including with the help of a colleague here in the economics department in New York City, in Chicago, in Washington. In Dallas, there's another program where they offer second graders $2 for each book they read. Now, one question is an empirical question. What will be the effect of these programs? And the results so far have been mixed. Money, the cash for grades has not improved grades or standardized test scores. The offer of the money for reading books to the second graders did lead them to read more books. It also led them to read shorter books. But the larger normative question is, what lesson are they learning? Are they learning that, might they be learning, that reading is a chore to be done for pay, and if that's the lesson they're learning, then when the money stops, so may the reading, and the money may have had the effect of crowding out the intrinsic love of reading. Or it could work the other way, and it could be that prompted by the money, by the lower motivation, they read more books, fall in love with reading, and acquire the intrinsic love of learning that will carry on when the money stops. But these are complex questions, partly of economics, partly of moral psychology, and partly of moral reflection. And so what it suggests to me is that instead of conceiving economics as a value-neutral science of social choice, we need to reconnect economics with moral and political philosophy. We need to make it more empirical on the one hand, less formalizing. More empirical on the one hand to test these effects, but also, at the same time, more closely connected with moral and political philosophy. If you look at the classic political economists, the people who invented economics, going back to Adam Smith, from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx, for all their differences ideologically, they all shared the idea that economics was a subfield of moral and political philosophy. And only in the 20th century has it tried to establish itself as an autonomous science. And that's what I'm calling into question. Some other undergraduates before we open the floor generally. In the back.
You present a narrative of economic thinking taking the place of moral thinking somewhat aggressively, but I worry that another cause for this may be an actual weakening of moral thought in our society, perhaps as a result of consumerism and postmodern thinking. If this is so, I worry that the societal forces which have led an increase in market thinking are not really something that we can control, and that merely the idea of connecting economics to morality is not strong enough to affect the way that individuals live today. How, as a society, should we move forward to increase moral motivation for behavior?
Right, yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. I share your worry, and I agree with you that it's not enough. If this is a general feature of social life, the rampant marketization of social life, and if that's a problem worth worrying about, it's not a sufficient response to rewrite the economics textbooks and to reconnect economics with moral and political philosophy, as I've been suggesting, though it might be one place to begin. But I think at the same time, we have to try to create within public discourse a greater attention to the moral dimensions of these questions. If you look at the past 3 decades, roughly speaking, two things have gone together. Economics has moved further and further in the direction I've tried to describe, but also in the world, we have come to rely increasingly on market mechanisms in health, education, civic life, family life, and so on. And there's been a kind of hollowing out of public discourse, a moral emptiness, I think, in our public discourse, a tendency to recede from engaging with big moral questions in public life, partly because we know we'll disagree about them and we shy away from those controversies. But as a result, we've embraced, I think part of the appeal of markets and market thinking is not just the conviction or the hope that markets deliver the goods and promote GDP and increase prosperity. I think the deeper appeal of market thinking in the domains I've described is that it seems to be a way of deciding controversial, hard public questions without engaging in messy moral argument and disagreement. And so I think we need to reconsider that reflex and try to find our way to a morally more robust kind of public discourse, even as we are trying to, or if one agrees, to recast the way economics is conceived and taught. Yes? Go ahead.
So you talk about altruism, a lot in the second part of the lecture, and it seems that you think altruism. So you talked a lot about altruism in the second part of the lecture, and you seem to think it's a good thing. But I think that's a very strong assumption in itself, in my opinion. First of all, in the Israeli daycare case, why is it the case that you want the parents to pick their kids up early in the first place? Maybe they have very important things to do themselves. Maybe it's actually better for society as a whole that they arrive late. And the Switzerland case, how far does civic duty go? If altruism is indeed, as you described, cannot be depleted, or it's an unlimited resource, then the government can basically ask its citizens to do everything. And do you think that would be a better world?
Okay, all right, that's good. First, I don't want to suggest that the only moral sentiment or motivation or human good other than self-interest is altruism. In fact, I think it's a mistake to carve up the moral domain or the domain of motivations into self-interested ones as against altruistic ones. I think altruism is just one among many of what I called more generally the generous virtues or social virtues or non-market norms. Altruism is one, civic virtue is another, solidarity is yet somewhat different, and so on. Honor, talking about honorific goods, that's not altruism, but honor is nonetheless a non-market good worth caring about, especially in certain settings. So whether it's friendship or honor or civic virtue, there are a range of non-market values worth caring about. That's my general point. Now, the further part of your question is, well, maybe marketizing some of these practices, like at the daycare center, will have efficiency gains. These parents are doing important work. Maybe they shouldn't wrench themselves from an important meeting simply to get to the daycare center at 4 o'clock. Maybe it would be more efficient to hire a teacher to look after those children for the extra hour. In that time, the hedge fund manager could be making tremendous amounts of money and contributing to the common good, as only hedge fund managers can. So I don't rule that out. And I'm kidding you. You have a legitimate point. All I'm saying is we need to weigh the moral importance of those efficiency gains, whatever they are. If I'd been less, I was being a little bit polemical. I could have said that pediatrician should not be wrenched away from an important appointment to go pick up the child. So all I'm saying is we have to weigh whatever efficiency gains may be had by using the price system to allocate people's time with the norms that we care about in designing various social institutions and practices, and that the efficiency question alone does not decide it. Francis Cam. No, we're done. Well, we now can include everyone. Is that all right? So Francis Cam, who's no longer an undergraduate, but plays one on television, or once was. Go ahead. All right, let's get you a microphone.
I do a good imitation of being an undergraduate.
Go ahead.
So now's the imitation starting. So in the case of the Israeli daycare center, isn't one of the problems there that people are mistaking a price for something when they should be seeing it as a penalty? Yeah. The point here is that when you attach a money, it's not always something, is how much it's okay to pay, and then it's okay to get. Yes. This is supposed to be a sign that you are not supposed to be doing this.
That's good.
Similarly, so there's a mistake there to begin with, all right?
Right.
Okay. So, but when you get a Nobel Prize, there's a money reward that goes along with it, okay? And again, the money is not supposed to incentivize you to work late in the lab, presumably.
Right.
It is a sign of something. So money can function in different ways. And when people mistake the idea of a price for a penalty or a sign of, a reward for an incentive, that seems to be a problem. And I don't think, I would be interested. I didn't see that coming out in your talk, and I wonder, and I hope I've done a great imitation. Thanks.
Okay. Yes, I agree completely, and actually the distinction between a fine and a fee is very important. And in the case of the Israeli daycare center, they presented it as a fine, which suggests they want to discourage late arrival, and the problem was the parents treated it as a fee. And the difference between, and I go into the difference between a fine and a fee, I think it's quite important in the book. Another example of this would be speeding tickets. Now, there may be some people who say, well, I just need desperately to get a certain place. I'll drive at 85 miles an hour. I am willing to pay the fine, as if it were a fee for driving fast. And yet, we do consider that, let's say, a speeding ticket is a fine, not just a charge for driving faster. And we know this when most of the time, when we see someone pulled over by a police officer for speeding, we don't consider that as if this were simply a toll collector with a red light on the top of his car who is collecting the toll. Although I did, so I'm very interested, it's a very important distinction between a fine and a fee, and it's a distinction that has to do with the expressive meaning of, and it may be different. I found a wonderful counterexample to this idea that speeding is something that should be fined and discouraged, not something that should be charged for. When I ran across a case of a candidate for governor in Nevada a few years ago who proposed as a way of raising revenue for the state of Nevada without increasing taxes, establishing paid permission to speed for which you would pay $25 a day. You would pay and you would have a transponder. And on the day you wanted to speed for 24 hours, you could put up your transponder and drive 95 miles an hour on the highway in Nevada, and you wouldn't be arrested or stopped, but only if you'd pay the $25. So this comes as close as I've been able to find to a case where a speeding ticket is turned into, now the Highway Patrol in Nevada was desperately against this plan, spoke out against it, and the guy didn't win the election. But it is very important, this distinction between a fine and a fee, and the distinction has precisely to do with the matter of the norms, the expressive meaning of the payment, which distinguishes the fine from a market good. I mean, another way of thinking about this is if the spaces for the disabled to park, places set aside, and they say there's a fine if you park here. But suppose there's a busy contractor who really wants to park near his site, let's say, and he says, it's worth it to me to pay the $250 for an expensive parking place. Even if he paid the $250, we would still consider that he had done something wrong. And that bears out your point. So how we decide the distinction between fines and fees really goes directly to this question about what are the appropriate attitudes, what are the attitudes we want to cultivate such that the payment of the money may not wash it clean. Charles Fried.
Well, I found myself surprised that I agreed with almost everything you said, except for the Israeli daycare center. But I wish you'd been able to lecture us for another hour, because I fear this may look like an argument which proves too much, because you make a very good case for the fact that there's some things that money cannot buy. I wonder if you could spend another hour telling us about the things that money can and should be able to buy. Or do you think that ideally it's from each according to his ability and to each according to his need?
To cite an earlier political economist, well, I think that money should be able to buy lots of things, flat screen televisions, for example, cars, toasters, that sort of thing. And it's typically the case that with material goods like flat screen televisions, the effect I've been emphasizing, which is that marketizing the good changes its meaning, is less significant. If you sell me a flat screen television or give me one as a gift, it'll work just the same. The good will be more or less unaffected. But the same is less likely to be the case if we're talking about the use of cash incentives in the area of health or teaching and learning or civic life or family relations or personal relations, which is why I emphasize those areas where in recent decades markets have increasingly extended their reach. I don't think that I can give you quite as simple as an answer as I may just now have suggested. I don't think there is a clear and simple distinction between material goods on the one hand and all other aspects of social life on the other. All I'm suggesting is that for each area of social life where markets would govern, we have to ask not only about efficiency considerations, and not only even about fairness, which is a familiar enough rival to efficiency in the debates we have and in the debates economists are perfectly well aware of. We also have to take account of this third range of considerations beyond efficiency, beyond fairness, having to do with changing the character of goods and social practices in ways that we would or should regret. The corruption argument. David Leibson, who I should say, as the microphone is finding, Professor Leibson from the economics department is one among those economists who is not subject to many of the criticisms I just leveled against his brethren.
So I'll also say that one of the seminal events in my education was taking Professor Sandel's course back in the 80s that opened my eyes to an enormous range of issues. And some of that may be reflected in what I'll say. So I'm a little worried about the nature of the argument that you've made because I fear that the modern economist is presented as a caricature when you describe the kind of rabid marketization view. And I wonder whether that reflects a tale of the profession, kind of the ghost of Milton Friedman, or whether that reflects the core of the profession. So let me just run a quick experiment right now. How many of you, and don't be shy, please join me, are either an economics undergraduate or an economics doctoral student or an economics, or a person with an economics PhD? Please, raise your hand, stand up, whatever, so we see you all. Okay, so, I don't know, 80, 90 people in the room. Now, hands down. Now, let's go again. How many of you believe that universities, elite universities, should consider auctioning off not all of their positions to wealthy households who are willing to pay and win those auctions, but even auction off just a handful of positions in the undergraduate population? So if you think even one position should be auctioned off, raise your hand. Okay. So I'm going to guess that that's 15 out of the original 70, let's say. So the tale of the profession holds the more radical marketization views that you're describing, and the median economist doesn't believe that Nevada should sell the permission to speed. And we have a language for that. We would say it's an externality, it puts other people at risk, and that's why we don't want that to happen. I mean, I'm sure that's a familiar argument. So are you critiquing thinking like an economist, which I would associate with this kind of caricature view of Milton Friedman? Or are you critiquing the kind of typical modern economist who actually embraces a lot of the positions that you've described, and I think would agree? I mean, that paper you described, for example, about daycare in the Israeli context, that was a paper published in the leading economics journal, and a paper that has generated hundreds of follow-up papers and endless discussion in our world, productive discussion. That's the modern economic approach, and it really has, I think, little overlap with the kind of extreme position that almost everything should be marketized.
Okay, first, thank you for that, David. First, I like your tendency to do, your willingness to do experiments. Because part of my, and not only in this room, but in your work, because part of my argument about how economics should be recast is that it should be more empirical and less based on formalized assumptions. So that's the first part of my response. The second is, there are two ways of interpreting the experiment you just ran. One would be to say, since fewer than half of the self-described economists in the room raised their hands in favor of auctioning places in Harvard, it could be that that means that most economists have good economic reasons as economists to oppose that practice. Or it could mean that even economists who are in the grip of a certain set of assumptions are unwilling, on reflection, because they're sensible people, to pursue the full implications of their view. And the whole burden of my argument and the force of the examples in the book is to try to press and dramatize and force the second issue. And so what would be the real test would be to begin, the real test from the standpoint of the way of doing economics that I would favor, would be to take your experiment, David, as a starting point, and then to interrogate those who did and didn't raise their hands as to why. And I suspect that if we asked those who didn't raise their hands, maybe they were just bashful in this setting, but I think if we pressed them on their reasons to resist the use of the market mechanism to allocate places in the university, well, they might say, well, the first thing they would say is, well, there must be an externality here. But an externality quickly becomes a catch-all for all kinds of considerations that don't fit comfortably in the efficiency model. But then it covers up too many possible positions. So what I would really want to interrogate is, for what reason should seats in Harvard College, even a few, not be auctioned? And to see whether those reasons included reasons having to do with a claim about the purpose, the purpose of a university, properly understood, the right way of valuing a university that would be dishonored or degraded or corrupted if places were sold. And likewise in the debate about kidneys, and likewise in the debate about any number of the examples where we debate the proper reach of markets. And so my claim is that if we could work out that deliberation, the economists would be not forced, would be invited to reflect on the moral presuppositions that the official models, even at the mainstream, not Milton Friedman, but the standard efficiency models don't capture, which is why among the people I take on in the book are not just Milton Friedman and Gary Becker, but Ken Arrow and people like that. I have one example, but I'll give it later, about where I tried to do this with Becker and Posner once. But I'll come back to that after some other people have some questions. Yes? Yeah.
So as a disclaimer, I'm a health economist by training, but this is somewhat related to what David said. If you go back to kind of intro microeconomics, the fundamental theorem that the entire assumption about markets being a good thing and working well and we like them is based on, has as an assumption under it that you don't have transaction costs. So I think that if you were an economist by training, and you were thinking carefully about this assumption that markets were good, you would have to acknowledge that at least in some of the cases you're dealing with, there is a cost to marketizing the good that makes that theorem no longer necessarily true.
But what kind of cost? A moral cost or a transaction cost that it wasn't properly captured initially?
So, I mean, it's a question of utility, and actually the way I was actually, the question I was actually getting at was that there's a tendency within and outside of the field to simplify the conclusions. And I think that that tendency is probably not unique to economics, but it does possibly require a different level of responsibility out of the research that's produced and how it's communicated. And I'd be curious if you could talk a little bit about that and the ways that we could go about thinking about conducting and communicating research on these ideas so that they aren't necessarily misapplied.
Well, I would say, thank you for that. I would say first that to point to transaction costs, for example, that aren't captured in the model wouldn't be to go far enough from my point of view. The real question that I'm trying to raise is, why care about efficiency in the first place? Well, the underlying assumption, the reason to care about efficiency in the standard economic model is some kind of background utilitarian version of utilitarianism. But utilitarianism is a highly contestable moral theory. So at best, the concern with efficiency, even as one standard, never mind the primary or decisive standard, in mainstream economics, rests on a usually unarticulated and almost always undefended utilitarianism of some kind. And there are lots of reasons to question utilitarianism as a basis for social choice. One of them is to do with fairness and rights, but another is to do with the idea that utilitarianism, like efficiency standards, simply takes people's preferences as they come and doesn't judge them. That's part of the appeal of utilitarianism and the allure of market reasoning. It's non-judgmental with regard to the underlying preferences, except insofar as they harm other people. Back to the externality. And that's, I think, but that doesn't go far enough. It doesn't go deep enough. I think it's worth asking why we should install as the basis of social choice of utilitarian public philosophy that refuses to pass moral judgment on the underlying preferences it satisfies, even if the system is efficient and you can include the externalities and the transaction costs and all of that. What the corruption argument points to is the unavoidability of judgmental economics. That may be even more controversial, David, than behavioral economics. Judgmental economics, I guess that's really what I'm suggesting is what we need and what we can't avoid. Larry.
So I want to tag team with Charles's question. I mean, first, agreeing it would be wonderful to have another hour of the lecture. But I want to frame the question a little bit differently. I want to say, you set up all the weaknesses of economics as if the other way of approaching these questions is very strong, right? That moral reasoning would actually be able to resolve these things that economics can't. And the particular way I want to push this is, I was very optimistic that when you were drawing the line at material goods, you were then going to launch into a general attack on intellectual property, because of course that's a commodification, not of material goods. But let's think about that commodification. You know, 100 years ago, music was the sort of thing we shared with each other, right? We would sing with friends, we would have people around the piano or playing violins. That's how music was produced and reproduced. Intellectual property comes along and commodifies, and the market makes this something that we can actually sell, and there's a huge rise there. And the consequence of that is a lot of artists get money that they otherwise wouldn't have had. There can be a lot more artists here. Now, from one perspective, you can say we have corrupted music, because it's different. It's no longer this thing I give to you, it's this thing I buy. So it's corrupt. But from the other standpoint, you're going to say, well, you know, a lot more musicians, a lot more money in music, a lot higher range of music, maybe it's a good thing. And then, so the question is, if economics can't answer that question, if it's how does moral philosophy answer that question? You know, is it a good thing that we have commodified music? It's corrupted it. Do you want to say we have to go back to the world where we only give it away or share it? And what are the tools you've got, I guess, to answer that? And as the moderator, I have to say you have no time to answer your questions.
Well, moral philosophy can't resolve the question of how to organize the production and dissemination of music and creative activity. Neither can economics. Though both are relevant, part of the difficulty of the view that I'm proposing is that I'm challenging a theory of social choice that claims to offer a single principle for everything without offering another single principle that claims to offer a solution to everything. But in a way, that's my point. The argument from corruption seems less satisfying than either the efficiency considerations of the Economist or the fairness considerations of a certain branch of moral philosophy. Because both the efficiency considerations and fairness arguments, once we get them right, what's the best theory of fairness or of efficiency? Once we've got it, we can use it everywhere with regard to all manner of goods and social practices. If I'm right about the corruption argument, the question of social choice, how to allocate goods in various domains, whether it's health or music, or university admission, or honor, or babies, or procreation, or military service, will differ one case to the next precisely because, if I'm right, the proper mode of distribution has to be attentive to the character and purpose of the social practice. Now, the character and purpose of a social practice, music, health, education, will in each case be contestable. And engaging in the debate and reflection about how properly to value that social practice will touch on competing conceptions of the good. And so that's why I don't suggest that I have a method or a principle that can resolve, if only we can apply it faithfully, every dispute about the meaning of the good we encounter. It would be surprising if there were one such conception that would be appropriate to music and to health and to education and to civic life, let's say, though there may be some overlapping features that we could say something about. So I think that the kind of reflection that's required is normative. It involves moral philosophy in that sense, but it involves deliberating about the character and purpose of the goods at stake in these various aspects of social life. And so it leans against, maybe in an unsatisfying way, against our tendency, even our yearning to come up with a single overarching principle that could underwrite a science, whether of economics or, for that matter, a theory of fairness that once we had it, we could apply to all of these domains. May I just give the quick example in reply to David's test? I tried this out, this idea of trying to find cases where even the most hardened defenders of the orthodox economic view held. When I went some years ago to the Rational Choice Workshop at the University of Chicago, ground zero of this view, invited by Richard Posner and Gary Becker, who run this seminar. So I came stocked with loads and loads of cases and examples, like auctioning university places and so on, confident that through a proper dialectic I could find some cases that would move even them to want to rein in the reach of markets. And I tried one after the next and came up empty, until finally I did find one. I asked them about for-profit prisons, and of course they were fine with the idea of for-profit prisons. And then I suggested that we ask about the different aspects, the different functions that prisons serve. Outsourcing the food service, the cafeteria in a prison, few people would object to. What about outsourcing the cleaning, the janitorial services? Very hard to see what would be wrong with that. And then we came to the health service. Well, it might be a closer call, but why not? If the health can be provided more efficiently by an outside health clinic coming into the prison, why not hire that out? What about outsourcing the guards? Well, so long as the guards have to obey the same rules and practices set down by the state, and you can enforce that, why not? And what about the prison warden? Well, there likewise, so long as the policies are in place, you could hire that out. And then I asked, take a state with capital punishment, Texas, for example. The job of the executioner. Why not put that out for bid? And on efficiency grounds, you would want to find the person who was qualified to do the job, to pull the switch on the electric chair, and who was willing to do it for the least amount of pay. Now, chances are in Texas, if you held that auction, what would happen? Well, the willingness to take that job, the wage rate would be bid down quite low, maybe to zero, maybe to negative territory. So that there would be some people, I suspect, it's not implausible in the state of Texas, who would offer to pay for the privilege of pulling the thing and the electric chair to carry out the execution. On efficiency grounds, it has all the advantages of the price system in these other areas. It will help the budget deficit of the state of Texas, lower taxes, whatever you want to do with the money. Maybe people would bid for that privilege the way they would bid for those few places that Harvard might auction off. And I asked them, would you favor that? And here I finally divided the two of them. Becker said, fine. And Posner said no. And so, finally, I had my opening. And so I said, why? He said, well, for your kind of reasons. Anyhow, thank you very much.